Good morning. I'm Jennifer McClendon, Education Manager for Sportsfield Management Association. Welcome to SFMA's webinar series to highlight the educational offerings scheduled at the 2025 conference in Palm Springs, California. Today's speaker is Dr. Bryan Hopkins. Dr. Hopkins is a certified professional soil scientist, CPSS, specializing in turfgrass science and management. He is a professor teaching and conducting research at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. He consults with a wide variety of organizations and is internationally renowned, as evidenced by the honor of being among the less than 1% of scientists selected as a fellow in the Soil Science Society of America and the American Society of Agronomy. He and his wife, Carrie, have 6 children and 10 grandchildren. Today, Dr. Hopkins will be presenting native versus sand root zones, compaction, aeration, and infiltration. Dr. Hopkins?
Thank you. It's good to be here, and it's actually 10.5 for you have two grandkids in the oven, so it means I'm just getting old. I don't know what how many grandchildren means when you retire, but I think I'm getting closer all the time. So it's good to be here. I'm excited about this topic. I do a lot of work with sports fields and in both my teaching at the university as well as working with a large number of clients that we deal with, and lots of questions. I'm not going to cover anywhere close to everything that we would need to. We'll cover some things today just to kind of give you an idea. Hopefully, try to give you some valuable information, though, some worth your time. I just remind people, I love this picture, that we kind of forget about the half of the plant that's below the soil surface sometimes. And as a soil scientist, I'm keenly aware, but I think that, half that plant is down there. We ought to be thinking about that maybe a little bit more than some of us do. So over my career, I like to say that what I've learned is that we know exactly what plants need. There's really no surprises out there. And also that snake oils are only for the snakes. I want to kind of start off with that because I see lots of products making claims to fix compaction problems and all sorts of things, and I've tested many of them, and by and large they don't work. It doesn't make any sense to try to use a chemical solution to solve a physical problem. And what we're talking about today are physical structures of the soil, physical problems, and obviously you need to get the chemistry right in the soil too, but it kind of is a partner, but it's not a way to just spray some foo-foo juice and I think it's going to solve your problems. I mean, we've got to have good soils and pay attention to how we do them. So what do we need? What do plants need to thrive, and not just be alive, but actually thrive? I like using this thing here with Homer. Yeah, he's alive, but how well is he really doing? Some of our sports fields are like that. They're alive, but they're not really thriving. So what can we do better? I like to point out that we can grow really great looking grass inside of a room with no soil, no natural sunlight. We're artificially supplying everything in this situation with my student Beth here. And those are some really nice looking plants. Those roots are long. We don't normally see roots that good in nature. Now, we're not doing anything spectacularly weird. We're just paying attention to good agronomic practices and trying to give these plants everything that they need. So what do they need? Well, we need nutrients and water. We need the proper environment, including sun and pH of the soil and et cetera. Absence of toxins, and then minimal pest pressure. So those are the things I need. And soil is involved in every one of those. And today we're going to think about the genetic potential of these plants. Again, look at those roots and how do we do that? The ones on the left have got everything right. The ones on the right aren't so healthy, and that's not my topic today, why they're not healthy, but just showing these is like, yeah, there's some great genetic potential, and how do we reach that? But today we're gonna focus in on kind of this top one, the nutrients and the water. as part of this sand-based sports fields versus native soils. And so some of that's chemistry, some of that's physics. We're going to kind of mostly focus on the physics part of it. So I also show this picture, coming back to this again, and you're seeing that these roots are literally floating in water. And people say, wait a minute, isn't saturation bad? And normally, yeah, out in the soil, most of the time, if my soils are saturated, that's not a good thing. In these hydroponic solutions here, though, I've got oxygen that's being bubbled into that solution. So I have dissolved oxygen. So I can be saturated if there was oxygen, but I can make that happen in a hydroponic situation. I can't make that happen in a soil-based system. So typically, if I'm too saturated, that's a problem. So we're really talking about oxygen mostly here as one of the nutrients. It's a non-mineral nutrient. We don't add it, obviously, as a fertilizer. There's oxygen all around us. 21% of what we're breathing is oxygen. And so you'd think the plants would have a pretty easy time getting oxygen. But if the soil is saturated for a significant amount of time, it can run out of oxygen in its roots. The shoots are never deficient of oxygen. It's just the roots that are a problem. So when we talk about aeration, the important part of what we're talking about is oxygen. Plants do take some oxygen and move them from the shoots down to the roots, but we can't get enough. I mean, there's got to be oxygen in the soil. The other aspect of this is that we have respiration gases that have to escape. These plant roots, microbes, they exude all kinds of gases, and they can become toxic if they accumulate. So we've got to have good gas exchange, letting the oxygen in, letting the respiration gases out. And of course, we still need water, right? We've got to have a balance of water and aeration, and that's the key to having a healthy system, a physical system for these plants. It's like people, right? I've got to have oxygen. I need water. But I can drown if I get, not enough of one, too much of the other, etc. So we're really talking about water. We talk about water infiltrating into the soil and then percolating through the soil. How that happens is partly related to what a soil is made up of, specifically the sand, silt, clay, or what we call soil texture, plus the organic matter. And then how are those particles arranged? And that's what we call our soil structure. So it's really majority of how this happens is how those two things fit together, the structure and the texture and organic matter. And if you've taken a soils class ever in your life, or you've sat it through very many of these sessions, you've probably seen this soil texture triangle. And we get all kinds of different soil iterations of a soil texture, everything from extreme sands, which we're going to talk about today, very clay soils, silty soils, and then of course in the middle is our loam soils. One of the things that we sort of think about is like most people say, oh, sand is the answer. Sand, put some sand on, that's going to help my aeration. And there's a little bit of truth there, but I'll tell you what, sandy loams are actually some of the worst soils that we can have because we tend to have a wide distribution of particle sizes, and they kind of fit together in a jigsaw format, and they're really subjected to compaction. And so those sandy loams can be some of our worst soils. They typically don't have very good structure, and they can become very compacted and oxygen deficient and accumulate those respiration gases. So part of this whole thing too is water nutrient holding capacity. The number we use to measure that typically is the cation exchange capacity. That is really clay and organic matter. Sand, it doesn't really have much CEC, neither does silt. So really it's these clay and organic matter particles that determine water and nutrient holding capacity. So ideal soil, we've got some clay and organic matter to kind of help with this. We sort of defy that in some of our sports fields, which can be done, and we can talk about that a little bit today and more in January at the meeting in Palm Springs. But So we talk about soil structure. We need to talk about these soil pores. Again, in terms of water and air movement, it's about the soil pores. And we have different types of structures. And so some of our native fields have got really great structure that's granular, for example. But on the opposite end of that, we can get massive structure, which is like concrete, or single grain structure, which is frankly, our sand-based fields. And so, sometimes that works really good, sometimes it doesn't. But we talk about that. And the structure, it can be destroyed primarily by traffic on wet soils. And of course, we have traffic, and we sometimes need to play. We hopefully aren't, doing too much maintenance, especially with heavy equipment, when our soils are too wet or too dry, by the way. We want to kind of be in the middle. We want to have enough moisture to kind of have some strength, but not so dry that the particles just fall apart, or too wet, either way. But we play games sometimes in some sports when it's wet, and so we just have traffic, and it can destroy the soils. Some soils are more prone to that than others. Some kind of resist compaction, and others are really susceptible. But getting back to this pore size, we have macropores, which water moves through really easily. Micropores, water doesn't move. It pretty much is retained, so that the roots can use it, and it's held there. We want kind of a mixture of these things in an ideal native soil. Okay. And we get compacted, those macropores become less, and therefore we're not draining very easily. We're not percolating that water out. So we want to have a nice mixture of again, in native soils, of a mixture of macro and micro pores, so that we've got some percolation and some oxygen coming in, and respiration gases going out, and we're holding some water, but we're not out of balance. Now, sand-based systems, if they're built right, are actually mostly macropores, which creates a management headache. We do it because we want the benefits, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. So getting back to, again, soil texture is part of this. We talk about the native soils. Again, it's this fine balance of structure and texture, and there are billions of iterations of this. Some of these native soils are great. They make great sports fields. I've seen a lot of them that are really nice. I've seen a bunch of them that are just a disaster. Some of that's just inherent in the type of soil it is, the structure and texture. Some of it is management. Sometimes we abuse the soil, and it just is a problem. But like I got called out to consult on a high school sports field, and they were ready to pay me to help them build a sand-based sports field. And I looked at their soil, and I talked them out of it. They had this beautiful native soil with good structure. They had some areas in the field that needed to be fixed. But I just said, you've got good percolation and good structure in this field. I think it's a mistake, because you're going to be trading one set of headaches for another, and your maintenance costs are going to go way up. So to be honest with you, if I'm in a low to moderate budget situation, these native soils are potentially the better choice for me. But I need to learn how to manage them, and we're going to talk about that more in January. I'm not going to spend much time on that today in terms of managing a native soil. But let's kind of talk about sand-based systems. What is a sand-based root system? Well, kind of the most famous ones are the USGA spec golf greens and tee boxes, and then similarly, we have ASTM, which is American Society of Testing Materials. They have a spec for sand-based sports field root zones. We also have non-spec sand fields. We've got sand-capped fields. Then, of course, we just have top dressing of all kinds of fields. So we use sand throughout the sports turf world quite a bit in various scenarios. Now, we all know water moves through sand, pure sand, really quickly. Again, that's sand, like a sandy loam. Sometimes that's not true. But if I get just pure sand or close to pure sand, that water just flies through it, especially if it's medium or coarse textured sand. So the good part of that, the thing that we kind of emphasize, is that we get that great aeration, good oxygen, respiration gases leave very quickly. The bad part is we have poor nutrient water holding capacity, which increases my maintenance costs and trouble. I mean, I could deal with that. And we'll probably not have much time to talk about that today, but in January, we'll spend more time talking about how to manage that. But it is possible. Well, we do it all the time, but it is a consideration. So one of the things these USGA spec or ASTM spec root zones have is what we call a perched water table. And we are designing that on purpose. And we've learned how to do that based on the fact that these perched water tables occur in nature. So we get, a typical situation is you have an aquifer, right? And you've got this water table, we call the water table, right? This is this underground lake that's completely saturated in this aquifer. But sometimes we actually find these perched water tables that are sitting up above the aquifer in the unsaturated soil. And it's because there's a layering effect. And I'm not going to spend time today talking about that, but generally it can be like an impermeable layer of rock or soil, or it can be a permeable layer, which is what we do on the ones we build on sports fields. It's a permeable layer, but we use the physics of it to create this water table, and it kind of defies logic in some ways. But if we look at the physics of it, we understand how it works, and then we can manipulate it to our benefit. So how did that all happen? Well, World War II, we started having more prosperity, free time, more golf. Golf was really where it started. Golfers, of course, they stand in the clubhouse during a rainstorm waiting for the rain to stop. And then as soon as it stops, they go out and they want to golf. The problem is you get a native soil and you get all that traffic on the tee boxes and the greens, and it just creates a compacted, muddy mess. And so, high-end golf courses started turning to the soil scientists of the world and said, is there a way to fix this? And they worked with USGA to do that. And you, again, looking to nature to implement a perched water table system that would let us grow on sand. So the sand specs enabled us also to, if you use the right sand, I'll talk about that more in a minute, it can resist compaction. So we can deal with all that traffic and not have grass that's just going to go belly up and die on us. And then later on, ASTM specs were made for sports fields. They're pretty much the same. They're minor differences in how they're built, but we have our own set of specs for sports fields. So this is what it kind of looks like. The key is to create a root zone with the right types of materials. And in general, and I'm going to simplify, we'll talk about it in more detail in January at the SFMA meeting. But basically, we put sand on top of gravel, and we create a very distinct, sharp layer. That's one of the keys to this thing, is it can't be gradual. And if we do it right, with about 12 inches, that's kind of the textbook number. In reality, you should test every sand and gravel, and every one has the right number. It might be 9 inches, it might be 10 or 13, but it's going to be in that neighborhood of 9 to 13 inches sitting on top of gravel. And usually we put drains below the gravel so that we can move any water away. So that's what this perched water table system looked like for USGA spec golf greens, ASTM spec sports fields. So for example, this is one field here at BYU that I'm the architect for. We built this originally back in 2009. We just renovated it, put on new sod this last spring, but it's essentially a 9.5-inch sand with 1% peat moss, and we add the peat moss for some nutrient holding capacity. We built this. We worked closely with a lab to help us with the materials and testing materials. We built a mock-up of it because this is a huge cost project, so we want to make sure that everything was right. But I worked with BYU grounds and athletics to build this field, and it's been very successful. In fact, one of the best days of my life. I actually got a shout out on ESPN. We played Texas back in 2013, and a massive rainstorm came in. Locally, we had more than 10 inches of rain drop within about 30 minutes. It was crazy. I was there, and we had to take shelter. It was like a Kansas rainstorm, nothing like we usually get in Utah, but ton of water. Now we had lightning delays for like an hour and a half, but in terms of the field, it drained immediately and perfectly. It was awesome. I mean, it worked just like it was supposed to do. Like a native field, it would have, it would have been a mess. It would have just been a muddy mess. Now, there's certainly things we can do on native fields, and again, I'll talk more about that in January. But we can do some things to kind of help us through a rainstorm on a native field or a sand cap field. But the Cadillac version of a sports field are these ASTM spec fields. So again, these components, we have, sand is much bigger than silt, and which is much bigger than clay. We have organic matter. The different components, we have to have just the right size and shape of everything. Again, peat moss is an important part of this. We do need to have some. We usually add 1%, which is a 1 to 10 volume ratio, which gives me 1% organic matter. That's still pretty low. Like, if you had 1% in a native soil, that would be extremely low. But it's enough to kind of help, keep the water nutrients held in a little bit. So these ASTM spec sports fields, they have less than combined 5% clay and silt. So they're down here solidly in this corner of sand. That's what they are. They're almost pure sand. The size of shape of the size of the sand is critical. We mostly have the medium and coarse sand. We don't want, again, we don't want hardly any clay and silt, less than 5% total, but we also don't want very much fine sand or even very coarse sand. We want to have what we call a narrow particle size distribution with mostly this medium size sand. And that ain't all. The shape of the sand is actually important, and we have specs for that. And I don't have time to go into that, but that's part of the testing that we do. Because if I buy sand that's too round, that doesn't have enough angularity to it, or if it's too much, the perched water table doesn't work. And it's also more prone to compaction. And the gravel too. The gravel has the size and shape. So we have to test all of that when we're getting ready to build an ASTM spec sports field. Is we have to work with the lab closely to get all of these specs in line. And yeah, that can be expensive. For example, in the BYU field, we actually had sand custom built for us and hauled it all the way from Idaho in order to meet our specs. Now, you don't have to do that. I've worked with other folks where we just buy a couple of sieves, huge sieves, like you can dump a dump truck of sand into and wash and create your own sand. That's sometimes very doable, often very doable. It's not cheap, but maybe a little cheaper than hauling it all the way from Idaho. So how does it work? The idea is that if it's not saturated, which is most of the time, you've got this little underground lake of water, and the roots are deep enough that they can get down into that little lake of water. So despite the fact it's growing in sand, it's got water. If you took away that perch, that water is just going to go. And those plants, you're not even going to get through one day. On this type of a sand, you wouldn't get through one day in June, of a hot day in June, without having to irrigate more than once a day. But with this perch, if it's working right, it lets me get through more than a day with holding water in that system. The physics of it, I'm not going to talk about that much right now, but there's kind of a force field in that sand that holds that, and the force field in the in the gravel is less, and so the sand holds it stronger than the gravel does. So that's kind of how it works, but if it becomes saturated and it gets filled up all the way to the top, like in that Texas BYU game, now all of a sudden there's enough hydraulic pressure to push that water down into the gravel. So it kind of lets me, like I like to say, have my cake and eat it too. And that's how it works. It gives me water when I need it and drainage when I need it when it's raining. So again, sand becomes saturated, those forces push the water out, and it drains away. All right, so pros and cons of an ASTM spec sand-based root zone. We have complete control of the water. We're not subject to nature too much. That's pretty cool. And that's one of the main reasons we like it. Despite being a sand, there's enough water that I can get through a game without having to irrigate. This sand, if I get the right sand, it resists compaction, which is very nice. The cons is it's costly. We have to also remove the cores. I mean, we want to continue to top dress with sand to kind of help keep the field smooth, to help manage organic matter and thatch. And so we need to, top dress with sand. But for example, so we weren't really doing that well at BYU. And between 2009 and this year, so, we're talking quite a few years, we had actually built up 7 inches. So we started out at 9.5 inches. And by the time we went to renovate the field, we were at 17 inches, which is too much. That's a problem. We were getting dry spots. The perch wasn't working right. So you really have got to think about keeping that height. That's one of the main failures of these systems is that managers aren't paying attention to removing sand at the same rate you're adding it. Organic matter has to be kept at a minimum. I mean, like normally, like a native field, we love organic matter. It's good for soil, it's good for the environment, it's good for plants. But one of the problems with organic matter is that it can create a barrier to infiltration, especially when it's on a sand-based field. Now, there's not much room for forgiveness. When these soils dry out, they go quickly. There's not much of a buffering capacity, so you can't let them get too dry. And then, of course, the nutrient holding capacity is extremely low, so fertilization is a little trickier. And again, we'll talk about that more in January. In terms of the water nutrient holding capacity, just like to point out that if I have a pile of clay the same size as a pile of sand, it's got like 100,000 times greater surface area, and organic matter is even higher than that. But surface area is water and nutrient holding capacity. So that's why clay and organic matter are what are responsible for water and nutrient holding capacity. And so I don't have much of that in these sand-based sports fields. So, these things can be great. They're an awesome tool on a high-end sports field. I would say though, you have to consult with an expert. You need to work with folks that know how to do it. You can't just go out there and do it. I've seen many systems that were installed and they weren't installed properly, and they don't work. So we get non-spec sand fields. Somebody just goes down to the sand quarry and just says, "Hey, we're going to put in a sand field," and then it doesn't perch. It's prone to compaction and plus it just doesn't hold water and nutrients. So you got all the negatives. So I'm not too thrilled. Sometimes I've seen non-specs fields that are tolerable. I've seen some total disasters though too. And then of course we have sand cap fields. We'll spend more time on this. I'm just short of time today, but there's a lot of sand cap fields out there that's lower cost. They certainly have their place in the sports field world. We've got several here at BYU. You do have to have drainage though. I mean, that's a problem. You're not going to get the situation that I described in that BYU Texas football game. A lot of times these things are kind of like a bathtub. You're grown on sand, but underneath it is a slow draining native soil that's often compacted, and there's nowhere for the water to go, even if you put in a drain system. And I always like to tell people that water doesn't move laterally in these shallow soils. So I see a lot of drain systems that are put in these sand cap fields, and frankly, most of them don't work. Yeah, they drain right over the top of the drain, but in between the drains, if it's on a 15-foot center, you're not getting any drainage to speak of. So you got to deal with it other ways. Surface drainage is super important with these sand cap fields. So if it's a soccer field, it's important to tilt it so that you've got at least 1% drainage, surface. If it's a football field, you typically want to crown it so that you've got surface drainage to help with, if I get a really big storm. And of course, and we'll spend more time on this in January too, but aeration and top dressing with sand, that's, we do over time, even in a native field, we're typically top dressing with some sand at really low rates. Important to not put on too much at any one time. I've seen some real disasters. Think about how you make concrete, sand and limestone, and especially in the West, we have limestone in our soils, and I've seen people turn their soil into concrete basically. And so you got to be careful. Put on low rates, quarter of an inch or so. Fill up those aeration holes. I mean, that's a valuable tool of part of what we do in the sports turf world. So, well, that's what I had as a teaser for January. Hopefully, you learned something. But I will be covering more details in January at the meeting, at the SFMA meeting. But yeah, have any questions?
If anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat. Doesn't look like we have any.
Great. That's either really good or really bad.
Well, thank you for our participants for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Hopkins. We certainly look forward to this presentation in Palm Springs in January. This presentation will be offered at the conference on Wednesday, January 15th from 8 to 9 a.m. And if you're unable to attend the conference, we will have all of these sessions recorded in our educational library. Thank you again, Dr. Hopkins, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day.
Thank you.